Alex here with a legal nuts and bolts video on piercing the corporate veil. One of the questions I've gotten on occasion, not very often, but on occasion, is the question as to this idea of creating an LLC or a corporation that's just you. It really is just you by yourself, to kind of limit liability to yourself for whatever type of business you're trying to operate. I've gotten questions on it from both perspectives. From the perspective of a person who wants to do it because who knows, they're doing like freelance work on the side or something and they just want to have their own business entity that they control. And also from the side of a person who is either concerned that they're not going to be able to get their money back because this business entity is indebted to them and it may be just like a defunct or a fake business, and also from the idea of if you did win a lawsuit, how would you collect if the business entity just claimed it had no money or went bankrupt or just evaporated overnight or whatever. Well, they have something in the law called piercing the corporate veil, which can be done and it often is done against these teeny tiny little LLCs, corporations that are just sprung into being by just some random person who decided that they wanted to put some assets, or put even not even put assets into it, just have a separate entity that they felt might protect them. I think they call it limiting their liability from whatever kind of deals the business entity goes into, whether it's getting a loan to operate or selling stuff that later on needs to be refunded because maybe it was faulty or something like that. So anyway, just want to let my viewers know that there is a name for it, and it is a thing in court, and it does happen, and it's called piercing the corporate veil. And the court basically says that this LLC or this corporation really wasn't operating as its own separate business entity. It was just the alter ego of the guy who runs it or the guy who creates it. And they go about determining if that's something that they can do depending on the circumstances of the case. So it could have to do with like the individual who's running the business entity mixing their assets up with it, like they call it commingling of assets. So like maybe they share bank accounts, like the business entity shares a bank account with the person who runs the business entity, and they pay each other's bills and stuff like that. Another way they refer to it is that the business entity doesn't stand on its own 2 feet. It's not really sustaining itself. It's not generating enough income to operate. It's instead being propped up by the individual. The other thing that really comes into play that really increases the chance of the court piercing the corporate veil is that the business entity is what they call closely held. It's a closely held corporation or a closely held LLC. And what they mean by that is it's just under the control of a single person or maybe a handful of people. It's not like a massive corporation that has thousands upon thousands of shareholders. It's publicly traded with a full board where, you know, the CEO and the CTO and all those different officers are all different people. In Nevada, when we have a lot of these teeny tiny corporations that are created, one guy is acting as all of the officers, the treasurer, the CEO, everything. For the LLCs, it's an LLC of just one guy or maybe 2 people. And so these are what are considered closely held corporations or closely held LLCs, and it increases the chance that the court will pierce the corporate veil. There are ways, you know, that, you know, those particular individuals can prevent that. They just have to make sure, even more so than an ordinary corporation, multi-million-dollar corporation with investors and such, they have to make sure they're doing everything on the up and up. They have to record minutes, you know, of their yearly meetings. They have to, you know, have bylaws. Their articles of incorporation or their articles of organization have to be legit. They have to be, they have to comply with whatever standards are out there. I'm not even sure as to how it works. I do know they have to have one, but the court would look at all of these things to determine whether or not the business entity is just a sham. If it's just a shell of the guy who's operating it or running it. And if the court comes to that conclusion, the court will pierce the corporate veil, and the person who sued or is trying to collect from that business entity will be able to go after that individual, despite the fact that they thought that their liability was limited, despite the fact that they thought that the business entity would be treated as a separate person. The court can bypass that, and it often does happen because I think a lot of people who don't have a full understanding or a full grasp on the law don't truly realize just how many loopholes aren't actually loopholes. There are solutions in the law that have been there since forever. And I worked for a company once. It's defunct now. It was called what was it called? The People's Interest Law Firm. It popped up when the housing crisis happened back in 2008, when the market collapsed and all these homes were being foreclosed on, and they were trying to help people keep their homes, and I guess they were doing so in an unscrupulous manner. And I recall one of the things that they had done to a lot of the employees is they told the employees that they had to create their own LLC to work there, and that they would all be contractors. And my understanding is that that didn't work out. They didn't try that with me, but they tried it with the other employees, and several of them had done that. They created LLCs, and they tried to kind of act like the LLC that the employee had created was the one that was employed by the actual company, and they did it to get around taxes, payroll taxes, and what it really did was just offload a whole bunch of the tax liability to the employees. But, you know, in the end, I don't think that really ended up happening to them. A lot of them contested it with the IRS and with the state, and I think for the most part, the owners of the corporation got saddled with all that debt. There was another reason as to why I think it happened to them, though, and that is fraud, which I should go into in this video. Another one of the manners in which the corporate veil can be pierced is if somebody can show that they committed some serious act of fraud, and the court would allow whatever particular individual that happened to have committed that in their capacity as officer or whatever capacity they had running that organization, allowing whoever it was that sued that business entity or is trying to collect from the business entity to go after that specific individual, the one who defrauded people. That's another way in which the corporate veil can be pierced. There's a couple of other things that I noticed in case law with regards to it, like when a business entity took on debts that it just had no hope of being able to pay back. Like it was obvious they were done for, and yet they still purchased things or took on debts or enrolled people, I don't know, maybe in services or something like that, even though they knew they were going under. That would be another reason by which whoever it was that made that decision could be held personally and individually liable for what ordinarily would be left, liable to the business entity. So before I end this video, I do want to mention there is this concept of reverse pierce, what do they call it? Reverse piercing the corporate veil, which is to go the other way around. There was a lot of controversy about the idea of reverse piercing the corporate veil in California. I didn't read a whole lot into it because my understanding is that the case law that did not allow it in California has been disapproved of or abrogated in its entirety. But basically, the idea is the same, it's just flipped around, and I think it has to do with an individual who is liable for something that that particular individual has done, yet they have either transferred their assets into a business entity, or maybe they had already existed there and the business entity was really just an alter ego of the individual. It wasn't really doing anything, it wasn't really operating, it was just the guy with his assets held, in a business entity. It was just using it like a second wallet. And so they will allow somebody who has sued that individual to reverse pierce the corporate veil and be able to reach into and seize assets or go after the business entity itself. From my understanding is that the way they deal with this varies depending on if it's a corporation or if it's an LLC. And I think it has to do with the fact that you could get something called a charging order against an LLC, and that probably impacts as to why reverse piercing the corporate veil was so complicated to begin with, because there are other remedies out there available. For those of you that don't know what that is, a charging order is an order that a court gives to an LLC commanding the owner of the LLC, the person who is operating the LLC, commanding them to turn disbursements over that would have been given to the individual instead to a judgment creditor in a case. So it's the same thing basically. It's just like you don't really have to reverse pierce. You can just have the court, issue a charging order to the LLC, and that'll basically divert the assets that would be coming out of the LLC into the hands of whatever individual that the court feels is entitled to that money. So hopefully this video was interesting to a lot of people out there. I know that many people think that this is just a loophole, that just some rando out there can create a LLC or a corporation and then conduct funny business with it and cheat people out of money and stuff like that. Well, it's not really true. The corporate veil is powerful. It can shield individuals who are running a business entity from a whole lot of liability if run properly. But if people play around with it and try and treat it like a loophole or play games with it, the court can just as easily pierce that veil and allow the individuals who are running the business entity to be held liable. So with that being said, I will see you guys next time. Definitely post something in the comments below if you're curious about it or you got questions on it. So yeah, see you guys next time.